Types of transport across cell membranes. So the first one is simple diffusion. So we're talking today about how materials, oxygen, glucose, stuff like that, can get through a cell, either into the cell or out of the cell. So the first type is probably the easiest. It's called simple diffusion, as opposed to some more complex types of diffusion or some diffusion that needs help. Anyway, look at the dots here. They spread out to go everywhere. So that's sort of what happens if you have a beautiful bottle of perfume and you open up the top, you unscrew the cap, and so here's the cap, and you just leave the cap here. And so you've got all this great smelling perfume, and you leave the cap off, and the perfume, if you come back a couple days later, will have all gone away. And so what happens is that it goes from a high concentration out to a low concentration. It just spreads out like that. And it's really hard. If I said, "Oh no, this perfume was really expensive. I'd like to get it back." I can't go out and take all that perfume and shove it back in. Um, that would be really hard to do. Your cells can do it, but they don't do it by simple diffusion. Simple diffusion just means from a high concentration to a low. Things just spread out. So materials move from a high concentration to a low concentration. And this is just the way things happen, so it doesn't actually require any energy. So here's a picture showing you diffusion of liquids. So here's water, and they put in some food coloring. And you can see it starting to spread out. It's actually moving by convection here, but see the fuzz? The fuzz is the diffusion. And so molecules just kind of bounce around and hit into each other. Those are supposed to be arrows. And bounce around a little bit more and bang into each other, bang into the sides. Eventually, it's going to end up looking like this. And so what you have is a high concentration here of dye and a low concentration out here, and things tend to spread from high out to low. And so here it looks like this, with all the dye kind of spread right out. And so that simple diffusion happens in a cell membrane, across a cell membrane too. So here you see a lot of them, and they spread into here. And so now look at how even it is. So this is supposed to show oxygen that's just sort of moving, bouncing around. Again, you have lots of oxygen out here, and here's the cell membrane. And the oxygen just sort of bounces around, and some will move back out, but they're just kind of going to even themselves out. So materials move right through the plasma membrane or the cell membrane from a high concentration to a low concentration. This does not require energy, so that's important to know. Things just kind of go from high to low, and that's just the way things are. Your cell doesn't have to put in any special energy for that. It just happens. So here's some examples of simple diffusion. You can see stuff just going from where there's a lot to where there's not so much. So that happens, for example, with your body cells if oxygen or water diffuses into a cell. Could also happen when carbon dioxide diffuses out of a cell, out of a body cell. And here's another picture of diffusion, things going from high, spreading out to low. So they're going from a high concentration to a low concentration. Another way that this is written sometimes, it's almost written like this, C high down to low. So some call it a concentration gradient, where you're going from high to low again. So you can call this going down a concentration gradient. So I kind of think of saying things go from high concentration to low concentration is more straightforward, but a lot of times you'll see it this way. You can say a material is moving down a concentration gradient. That means from high to low. So you've got to picture it more like a hill instead of the way it is with a lot of stuff here diffusing out. So if you have a lot of stuff here, like maybe you've dropped some perfume or something, it's going to spread every single different way. So it doesn't really look like it's going down or up or whatever, but you definitely have to think of it over here more like a hill. So high concentration to low concentration would be down a concentration gradient. So if these materials are moving that way, that would be down a concentration gradient. If you ever see stuff moving this way where there's not so much and you're shoving it to where there's a ton, another way to picture it would be like this. There's a ton here, and you're shoving every last one over this way. That would be going up a concentration gradient. And your body can do that, but it takes a lot of energy. So this one going down a concentration gradient, like this, that does not take any energy at all. It's easy. So there's also a couple of terms you need to know, solute and solvent. Oops, wait a minute. So solute moves down a concentration gradient, so that means from high to low. So let's define solute. So the terms to know, solvent is the liquid that does the dissolving, and solute is the thing that gets dissolved. So I've got this beautiful swimming pool at home that's shaped like a cocktail glass. Doesn't it look like a V, sort of? Shaped like a V. And it's got this fantastic slide too. And so this is solvent, right? Because there's a V there, that's the solvent. And then there's this kid who likes to come over and play with my kids. His name is Lou. Come on in, Lou. Here's my kids playing in the water. Yay! Come on in, Lou. The water's great. So all the people playing in here, wee, include Lou. And so the stuff that's dissolved in the liquid are Lou and my kids. So the solute is the stuff, like the sugar or the salt, and the solvent is the water or whatever else something is dissolved in. In biology, it's always going to be water because you are made out of a lot of water. Quiz time. Materials naturally move from an area of low to high or high to low concentration. So that would be high to low. Materials naturally move up a concentration gradient or down a concentration gradient. So it's going to be down a concentration gradient. So you'll need to know both ways. Dissolved materials are called solute. Hey Lou, come on in. Get dissolved. The liquid that something's dissolved in is called the solvent because see the V? That's the shape of my beautiful weird pool. Solvent. It's a very cool pool I have. When sugar is mixed with water, the water is the vent, the solvent. When sugar is mixed with water, the sugar is it's the stuff that gets dissolved, so that's the solute. There are many materials in blood. The plasma, or the liquid part, is the solvent. There are many materials in blood, including calcium. The calcium would be the stuff dissolved, so that's the solute. Come on in, Lou. The water's great. Okay, osmosis. So osmosis sounds straightforward enough, but it's actually really hard to think through. Osmosis is just the diffusion of water across a membrane, and so that sounds really easy until you start looking at it. So water moves from an area of, you guessed it, high concentration of water to a low concentration of water. Here's the confusing thing. When you have high water concentration, you have low solute. And when you have low water, you have high solute. Blah. What that means is, let's say you have two containers and you filled them both with water. And so these are both filled with water. This one, let's say, has a ton of dissolved stuff in it. If you take water and here's your bag of sugar. What is going on with that? Okay, let's do it up here. So, okay, so let's do this. Here's a cup. I don't know why my stuff isn't drawing. This is really annoying. I don't even know what to do about it. Okay, so anyway, let's draw it up here. Look at that. So you have two cups, and you fill them both with water. If you take a bag of sugar, and this is all sugar, and you pour it in here, it's going to displace some of the water, and some of the water will come out and form a puddle here. So that means when there's stuff dissolved, there's less water there. So if you have a high concentration of stuff, you're going to have a low concentration of water. Here you have no sugar in it, you'd have high water concentration. So here's diffusion across a membrane, and so you have lots of stuff here, and then it diffuses out to spread out evenly. So it seems easy until you kind of look at it, I think. So here's a cell, and this is the dissolved stuff, and this is not water. Let's say this dissolved stuff is salt. So if you have a ton of dissolved salt in here, that means you have not so much water. So that means you have low concentration of water outside and right here you have a high concentration of water on the outside. And so water tends to go high to low, so the water is actually going to go in. The salt, you'd like, whether this is salt or sugar, let's say this is not able to move, because you would think these things would just diffuse out, and they would, except let's say this membrane doesn't allow sugar to move out. Let's call this stuff sugar, dissolved stuff. The sugar, let's say, is too big for the holes in here to diffuse in and out of. So the sugar can't move because let's look at the cell membrane. Maybe the cell membrane has holes in it that are this big, and let's say the sugar is just a little bit too big to go in and out of, but the water is little enough that it can go in and out easily. So the sugar stays put. Water tends to move from where there's a lot to not so much. So the water is going to move in because this stuff cannot move out. So there's a higher concentration of dissolved stuff on the inside. And that means there's a higher concentration of water on the outside, which is the first hurdle to get over. That's the hard thing to think about, I think. So for this particular membrane, the dissolved stuff cannot go through the membrane. It's stuck where it is. Maybe it's bigger than water and bigger than the holes in the membrane. But the water can move freely through it. So dissolved stuff stays, water moves. Water tends to go from a high concentration, which is outside, to a low concentration, which is inside. And so that means water is going to go high to low. Oh, look, I drew all the arrows in already. Okay, here's another picture of it. You've got lots of green stuff dissolved here. The water are the little blue things. It looks like wings. They're the oxygens with the hydrogens on them. And so you can see you have more of the green stuff here, so that means there's less water there. So the water is going to be going both ways, but mainly going this way to the right. So high concentration of water, low solute over here. Low concentration of water because there's so much green stuff in there. And so water tends to go that way. And you'll notice it goes both ways, but mainly it goes to the right. Here's another example. Here in this cell, there's a higher concentration of dissolved stuff outside. That's the red stuff, right? So that means there's a higher concentration of water on the inside. So you have lots of dissolved stuff here, not too much water. So this is going to be outside, low water concentration, not as much there. Higher concentration of water in here. Okay, so water tends to go from high to low. It's going to go out. So water tends to move from a high concentration inside to a low concentration outside. I just realized maybe I haven't explained concentration very well. So here's what concentration means. It's not the total amount. Here's me. And here's my brother. And let's say my brother is really short. Let's say he's only like 4'2". But he's a man, and so men actually have more red blood cells than women do. They have more per mil. So if you took a little tiny milliliter of blood out of me, there would be a certain number of red blood cells. And if you took a little tiny millimeter of blood out of him, you would actually have more red blood cells. And so he's going to have a higher concentration of red blood cells. But seeing as he's half my size, I actually have more red blood cells altogether. So when we talk about concentration, we're not talking about the total amount of something in my body. We're talking about how much stuff there is in one little area. So if you look at one little area here, not so much dissolved stuff. Here, lots of dissolved stuff. The more dissolved stuff you have, that means there's less room for water, so you're going to have a lower concentration of water here. Higher concentration of water here. Water tends to go high to low. It's going to go out of the cell. And so there are my arrows. You can draw arrows into your notes of all the water leaving the cell. This is going to shrivel up this cell. Here it's even. So the concentration of water, the concentrations of water are, are about the same. So water just kind of moves back and forth equally. Whoops. So let's draw your arrows in. Some water goes out, some water goes in, some water goes out, some water goes in. This is called dynamic equilibrium. Dynamic means it's always moving. Equilibrium means it's sort of the same. So equilibrium. Equilibrium means whatever amount you have inside, you have about the same amount outside. So if something moves in, yeah, things bounce around, but they sort of do it randomly, and as much stuff that goes in, you have about that much going out. Okay, some basic water balance definitions. So these are just a few definitions. Hypertonic. If you have a hyperactive kid, that means they're more active than usual. Um, so hypertonic means above. So you have a higher concentration of, and we base it on solutes, the dissolved stuff. So this you would have a hypertonic concentration. Sorry, wait a minute. Solutes. So you would have lots of dissolved stuff here. So it would be hypertonic on the inside. So hypertonic inside for that one. If you look at this one, there's lots of dissolved stuff on the outside. So that's hypertonic outside. Usually we talk about what the solution is outside the cell. Like we'll say the cell is put in a hypertonic solution. That would be this picture. Usually we don't do that first picture. Hypotonic. Hypo means below. So hypodermic, if you've heard of a hypodermic needle maybe, that's a needle that you use to put something in below the dermal layer of the skin, hypo meaning below. Hypothermia, that's when you're really, really cold, so that's a low, low, low temperature. I don't know, what's another term for that? I can't think of one. So hypo means below, or a lower concentration of solutes, the dissolved stuff. So in this case, this would be hypotonic on the outside. And that's how you would use this term. You would say you're putting the cell into a hypotonic solution. You don't much, but you could talk about like this. You could say there's a hypotonic cell compared. So you could say the cell is hypotonic compared to the outside. So you could say it's hypotonic inside. Typically, you would just say the cell is put into a hypertonic solution. But if you're talking about the cell, you can say inside here is hypotonic. Outside here is hypotonic. And then the last one is easier, isotonic. That means the same. So equal concentrations of solutes in and out. So here's what a cell looks like in an isotonic solution. There's 10% salt outside, 90% water. And look, it's the same here. So instead of looking at dissolved stuff, it's just giving you percentages. And so this, you're going to have a dynamic equilibrium, about even numbers going in and out. And I can see I've been talking a long time, so I'll finish this in the next